Hi everyone and welcome to The Knowledge. Yes, that's right. What's Your Meta has got a new thing on the block, and it is basically going to be us looking at frequently asked questions from our Meta community. And today I am joined by Fin McAndrew, our resident triathlon coach. Fin, how are you doing?
Good, thanks. Yourself, Jimmy?
Aye, pretty good. Hanging in there, mate. We're hanging in there. Obviously, again, in retrospect, we're in the middle of this lockdown with the whole COVID-19 thing. And this is also part of like our mission as well, to keep on reaching out to our community within our coaching world, but also the wider community of sport, triathlon, running, cycling, and try and help people just to kind of kill a bit of time and hopefully offload a bit of knowledge to them. So, Fin, today we're going to talk about a few things. We're going to talk about aerobic fitness, what it actually is. But first of all, let's go into your background. What is your background again for people who maybe don't know much about who Fin McAndrew is?
So I went to uni and studied applied sports science, where what really interested me the most in my degree was exercise physiology and specifically the biochemistry side of things, what happens in our bodies in endurance sport, and looked a lot at sports nutrition and how all those components played together in sport. And I've been racing long distance triathlon for over 10 years now, and really focused specifically on Ironman. So that's been very much what my attention's been directed to.
You've been quite humble there, Fin, but you obviously qualified for the biggie this year, Ironman in Kona at World Champs. Whether that's still going to go ahead is still a bit of in the unknown, but if anyone who has got any knowledge of triathlon, just literally qualifying for Kona is it's a pretty hefty task, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is the third time I've done it. So I qualified for the first time back in 2016, and I went and raced it that year. And then I didn't have long in between qualifying and Kona, so I didn't quite have the race that I wanted to. And then in 2017, I was in the same situation. I qualified again at Ironman UK, and I decided to not take my slot in October because I just didn't think it don't think it's the best way to do Kona well, is to race two big races back to back like that. So I turned down the slot and really then redirected my plan in terms of qualifying again, but doing it in a way that would have longer to prepare. So plan was qualify last year at Ironman Barcelona in October, to have a full year to prepare for it. So it's a bit of a shame what's happened, and it is looking more and more doubtful that it's going to happen now, but who knows what's going to happen, whether there's two world championships next year, might be a plan. We'll see.
Yeah, I think a lot of sport is in flux right now, and I think no doubt there'll be everyone who has qualified for something in any shape or form will have the merit will still be there with that achievement, I think, and it would be silly to be remiss of those things that people have achieved. So going off the back of that, Fin, just a quick, to qualify for Kona, what kind of time period are we talking about in the saddle, on your feet, and in the water combined?
So at Ironman Barcelona there, I did 8 hours, 40 minutes, 8 hours and 42 minutes. So that was a 54-minute swim for 3.8K, then a 4:38 bike for 112 miles, and then I ran a 2:59 marathon. And amazingly, I actually only qualified by, worked out as less than a second.
Wow.
So the guy behind me, this Norwegian guy, was the timing chip difference was 0.8 seconds, I think it was. So pretty crazy, yeah.
Midgie's eyebrow, as we say in Glasgow. So that then leads on to the conversation we're going to have today. It's all about aerobic training and aerobic endurance. So having done some extreme, endurance and aerobic-based racing as well as training, can you define what that actually is for people who are actually paying attention right now?
So aerobic training or aerobic endurance is when we're metabolizing fat or carbohydrates. We're breaking down fat or carbohydrate into energy in the presence of oxygen. And because it's in the presence of oxygen, that means it's very sustainable and we can supply ourselves with energy for a long time. So when you look at something like Ironman performance or longer distance events, you know, the ability to go fast for a long time is underpinned by your ability to work aerobically at a hard intensity. And that really is in essence what it is.
Okay, so then this maybe goes back to the old school way of thinking, but this is generally called fat burning or fat utilization training, which a lot of people kind of, there's two ways that people look at this. They look at it being either intervals, which is highly calorific and very, very short and sharp, that kind of HIIT training, but also from the steady state stuff as well. So what we do know is that the most abundant energy source within the human body is generally fats. It's dietary, it's intermuscular, it's intracellular, and it's under our skin. How can we get better at utilizing that as our main energy source?
So there's a few different ways that we can utilize that in a better way. So way to look at it is we only have about 90 minutes worth of carbohydrate stored in our body at a time. So it's a finite resource. Whereas, as you said, we've really got an abundant amount of fat stored in our body for energy, for exercise purposes. It's, you know, tens of thousands of calories worth of fat. So we really want to be able to tap into those energy supplies to train, to race, because if we can do that, we can spare our body's muscle glycogen, our body's carbohydrate stores, and we can be more reliant on those fat stores. But the issue is that as humans, we are primed to metabolize carbohydrate. You know, whether that's running for a bus, you know, running across the street quickly, playing with, you know, kids in the garden, playing football, anything like that, because carbohydrate supplies our bodies with energy faster than fat does. So when we need energy, it's a case of tapping into those sources first. So we can improve our ability to metabolize fat and become more efficient at utilizing that, but it does take a bit of practice. And what that really involves is training at the right intensity, first and foremost. So everyone always wants to go fast, everyone always wants to go hard, and they always ask for more. The one thing that people struggle with doing is actually slowing down and going at an easier intensity. So the first thing that we can really do to improve our fat metabolism is slowing down our training.
How would you define that for people? So we've got different parameters which we can use to identify what that actually is from a sensation and a number and a data point of view. What are those kind of things people should be looking at, Finn?
Yeah, so if you're training on the bike, for example, and you use a power meter, then you would probably know that you've got some zones broken down for your power. And typically we'd be looking to ride in about zone 2. To really promote fat metabolism at, you know, upper end of zone 1, zone 2. And as somebody gets, you know, more fat metabolized, they can then start to creep up into the higher zones and still metabolize fat. But for most people, is zone 2 riding. On the run, there are power meters available now as well to use for running, but most people will use pace. That's where we're looking to really go at the easier end of the spectrum. So maybe, you know, 2 minute per kilometer pace slower, for example, than you could run, 5K at. But we can then also use heart rate and we can use perceived exertion. One of the simplest ways to measure whether something's easy is just ask yourself, is it easy? Mm-hmm. So if you think something's too hard, you're going too hard.
I think the other way of looking at it is if you don't have any of that paraphernalia to help you kind of register it, first of all, it's very, very cheap. A heart rate monitor is very, very cheap nowadays. But again, conversation. Could you hold a conversation with somebody you're running with? Could you ask yourself, if you're mental, could you ask yourself a question out loud and answer it properly? It's things like that. And I think this also comes into the way in which you look at the terrain you're riding on or you're running on as well. You can, okay, flat and is quite boring, but it's also been thinking from the process of when you do hit a hill, use what God gave you on your bike, use your gears, just toodle up the hill. And for many times I spoke riding and I was focusing on this sort of stuff, and I'd go out the back of groups and people would think I was getting dropped, but what you're actually doing is you're being ultimately disciplined. And I think that's the one key thing we have to think about here, is that we have to think about food as fuel, not as diet, because diet is what you eat. food is fuel, and we have to look at how we are using that fuel to make our bodies more efficient for the actual thing we're doing. And a lot of times we don't do that because we have got ego and we don't like to get, a hard time off someone. But doing long, steady miles or long, steady runs on your own can be a bit deflating. So it's really about trying to get the right mix of terrain, company, and the mindset, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's really looking at every session and trying to optimize the conditions to make sure that you can achieve the objective of a session, because the company is a really interesting thing. Quite a common bit of feedback from an athlete is, oh, I was meant to be going easy today, but I was out with X, Y, and Z, and they were pushing the pace, and they end up going too hard. And so it's this is where, if you're going to train with people, they need to do what you're doing.
And the other thing is, as well, is the good old Strava head pops in sometimes. As if you are doing a steady ride, you'll feel actually really good. You'll feel like you're just riding along. There's no real, you'll be quite accustomed to how you feel in that. And you feel like maybe, oh, what harm's it going to do if I make a wee hard effort? But actually, it can have quite a mental effect on what you're trying to achieve, doesn't it?
Oh, totally, totally. The ego plays a massive part in how we're training and what effort we're going at. I think a lot of people would be shocked by the actual pace that some of the fastest athletes in the world do their easy sessions at. You take, Kipchoge, that broke the 2-hour marathon record there last year, and he'll go out and do some of his long runs slower than 5-minute K pace. Whereas you tell somebody to go and run at that pace sometimes, and they just think it's ridiculous how slow that is. But this is where you kind of just need to put a lot of it, your ego and things to the side, and just go, well, actually, I need to slow down to go faster. That's the irony of it. And again, going back to the point that we're primed to burn carbohydrate, it really surprises people when they slow down how inefficient they are actually metabolizing fat and how much they do slow.
Yeah, I've got a good example of that. When I was racing full-time, usually mid-season, we would have 3 maybe criteriums and maybe 1 road race at the weekend. And what I found out during that was that, you can't improve your fitness. Basically, what you start off at that 4-week block is basically the best you'll be. It's very rare you come out a block of racing or training like that and you're actually in better condition. Mainly because the majority of the races I was doing were criteriums, and there's a lot of travel. And basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to race flat out and recover flat out. So what happens is that you're fueling your body crazily with, carbohydrate all the time. Not necessarily the best food while you're at service stations, etc., which is where maybe food prep comes into it and planning a little bit. But what my nutritionist back then did, a guy called Mayor Rancheridos, he used to say that basically what we should do is every now and then, or in between these events, we should have a day where we try and do either a fasted ride or a really, really slow ride. So it's almost using the racehorse analogy. When a horse is racing, a racehorse doesn't gallop along. It's either walking really slowly or it's going flat out. So we have to kind of, when you are in high intense block of racing or training, you also have to take the foot off the gas. And when those rides are aimed at zone 1, zone 2, being more efficient, because I would find that I would go out for a 2-hour ride and I would blow my doors because my body was it's hungry for pure sugar. And that for me was a big, big wake up call when I was actually competing, because I realized that you don't realize how reliant your system becomes purely on that sugar, and then how inefficient that system can actually become.
Yeah. And I mean, and what you're really talking about there is one thing we don't talk too much about in training, but is the ability to have good metabolic plasticity, where we can dip in and out of different zones. And I suppose we have to look at the specificity of events where those crit races and those events were all about high power, high bursts of intensity, which you're always going to metabolize a lot of sugar for and a lot of carbohydrate for. And then when we start looking at those endurance events and those longer events, there's going to be moments when we need to fuel higher pace and higher efforts with carbohydrate, but we have to be really efficient at metabolizing fat. And that's where the training we do and the foods that we can also eat and the timing of fuel intake will massively affect how we what our bodies metabolize and what we'll actually take from our training session.
I think it's remembering that aerobic base, we talk about it so much as the foundation of training. It's not just the foundation of training and physiology, it's also the foundation of the efficiency and the economy at which your body can burn, isn't it?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you look at an Ironman where, we've just come out of swim where we've effectively swam hard for the best part of an hour, and then we've got to go and ride 112 miles bike, and then you get off the bike and you got to run a marathon. Now, if it doesn't matter how good you are, how long you've been doing it, your legs hurt at the start of the marathon. And for anyone that's run a marathon, maybe like a standalone marathon, you know how hard it is when you're just, halfway through that in itself. And if you can't metabolize fat as an energy source effectively in something like an Ironman, you just have no hope of being able to sustain a good intensity for the day of the race. And you undoubtedly hit a point where you run out of carbohydrate and you slow down, and that's a very hard place to come back from.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a backup and a safety net for that efficiency, especially for those longer endurance events. Whether it's even if it's just a 100-mile ride on the road or something a bit longer than you're used to, if you don't do those building blocks, from a fueling aspect and from a training aspect, from looking at the intensity you're riding, and again parking that ego when you're out riding and really trying to be rigid with it. Things like now you've got podcasts and you've got audiobooks you can listen to where you ride, obviously at a safe volume, etc., or even if you're riding on Zwift, watching a movie on Zwift, it takes that kind of the need to keep up and the need to press on away. So there is ways in which we can, ultimately what you're trying to do is distract your brain from, I'm not going to say boredom of it, but the simplicity of just trying to stay within that really, really low intensity stimulus, isn't it?
Yeah, session doesn't always need to be all bells and whistles. Sometimes the best sessions are the most simple sessions where it's just go out and execute a pace well for a set period of time.
I think it also comes down to what you also, another aspect you kind of hit on there is sexy training. And we see this an awful lot in S&C when you have like your Nino Shutter session, and suddenly everyone wants to be on a balancing board, everyone wants to be juggling and stuff like that. But that skill, which has been acquired over several years of training, strength underpins everything, as well as what we're saying here is that the aerobic system underpins everything as well. So strength underpins it in the gym, and aerobic capacity and the ability to really be well trained and have good aerobic endurance really underpins your training when you're out doing your actual sport, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's that foundation, and a good term I always talk about is don't try and live in your house before you've built it. That's what we're doing with endurance training. And even look at the balance of training where, if you do your easy training easy, then you can do your hard training hard, because the more efficient you get at metabolizing fat, the more carbohydrate you'll spare. So then when you go and do a hard session, you've got that energy there available to use it, because we forget it can take about, a good 48 hours to replenish our carbohydrate, our glycogen stores once we've depleted them. And then you add on the neuro system and the nervous system stress of a hard session as well, and going too hard. And if you just keep layering that on top of one another, you break down at some point. So this is where it really is, keeping that training easy.
And I said the first sense of that, we would probably talk that it would be like a central nervous system fatigue and neuro fatigue you would get. And the first thing that's going to really show up is sleep. Sleep is going to go absolutely out the window when you do that sort of stuff. So that's a good wee take home. If you're sleeping, the basic rule of thumb of overtraining, overreaching are loss of appetite, bad sleep pattern, and generally being pretty grumpy, which in my case, I was pretty much grumpy a lot of the time. So we've talked about the sexy parts of all of these things, and there's loads of stuff floating out there, Finn. Two things that always pop up in this kind of FAQ sort of situation is fasting and fasted rites, and ketosis. Ketosis has been one of the most, biggest buzzwords within endurance sport in the last couple of years. More so now that we're seeing gels appearing, the ketogenic diet appearing. What's your take on that, and how can that then be migrated into a simple application for people who are watching just now?
Yeah, so I think something that athletes have always done is fasted rides or fasted sessions, and elites have always periodized what they eat, depending on what training they're doing. So fasted rides or doing a session without eating anything first is always a good way to increase your fat metabolism. So you wake up in the morning, you've not had anything to eat, and the last thing you ate was 7 o'clock last night. You're not going to have much carbohydrate readily available in your system. So if you go out and do a training session at that point, you're in theory going to metabolize some more fat, and that will force you to go slower as well because you don't have the energy levels there to go harder too. So that can increase our fat metabolism. The idea of ketosis is ketosis is when the concentration of ketone bodies in the circulating the bloodstream increase, and ketone bodies are derived from fat. And so when glucose isn't present and we need energy, ketones are produced, and our body starts using that as an energy source. Now, there's a few different ways to make that happen. The extreme way is that you don't eat any carbohydrate for 3 weeks. And when I say no carbohydrate, I mean less than 50 grams. And you would not want to do that right now, because that can also have a bit of an effect on your immune system. But the smart way to do it is by putting in some training sessions where you plan properly, not eating before it, and doing it at an easy intensity. You're not overloading the system there, but you're encouraging the body to metabolize fat through some ketosis. The other way you can do it is, again, going back to looking at food as a fuel. If we actually fuel our body with some fat, some good fats before a training session, we can prime our body to metabolize fuel. So one of my favorite sessions is a long aerobic ride, where I will eat a higher fat breakfast, and I'll then go out and ride for, say, 4.5 hours. But for the first 2 hours, I won't eat anything. So I'm trying to encourage my body to metabolize fat. But for me, I would struggle to do that if I didn't have a higher fat meal before. And I actually feel like I get more quality by including some fat in the diet.
So that's the difference here. We're doing a fasted ride, but we have to acknowledge that that system can only run for so long before you actually have to put something back in. Again, the key word in this is fueling the body. It's not starving the body of energy, because it still needs some form of energy. When you do those rides, what do you generally take on board, Finn? Do you switch to carbs, or do you continue to try and be low carb, high fat? What would you usually snack on during that?
So typically I will not eat anything, and then I'll switch to carbs, because for Ironman racing, it's really been proven that you want to be very fat metabolized and very efficient there. But when we talk back to that metabolic plasticity, we also want to be able to switch on and utilize carbs very fast. Yeah, we're able to work through those different zones. You can take, some higher fat snacks with you out on a ride, and there are some products out there which are now, making that happen, because some athletes who really want to go, full gun with it and only eat high fats, there is some evidence that you can start shifting into metabolizing fat even up as high as zone 4 on the bike power levels. So there is some really interesting stuff. But for me, I find that the safest way and the best way to do it and getting a nice mix is by not eating for a set period of time, but fueling it with high fat, and then switching to the carb intake that I would use in a race.
Mm. Okay, the other thing is as well, also there's ketone gels and that come out as well. Would that be something you would maybe, if you can get your hands on them, would a ketone gel be a good thing to use in a situation like that?
Yeah, definitely. I think, and at set points in the year. So when you're doing a block of more aerobic based training and you maybe don't have a race in the immediate future, that would be an opportunity to then increase that fat metabolism. And that's where you could do some 3-4 hour rides and not take, any carbs on, in theory, and get your body really efficient at metabolizing fat.
Okay, and the other thing we've got to think about is the amount of time that it takes you to actually reach ketosis. It's not literally for efficiency and the way you can periodize this sort of stuff into your training and your fueling strategies. Fasting is probably the easiest of the two. And the reason behind that, Finn, is literally the amount of time it takes you to get into ketosis. So how long does that actually normally take?
Well, yeah, a long time. I mean, like you said, to get into full ketosis, where you're metabolizing all of your energy, or the predominant amount of energy from fat, that is really 3 weeks, 2-3 weeks of a low carb diet. So yeah, a long time. And that's where you really need to plan that out well in advance and do that at the right time. And that does take a lot of planning.
Yeah, and that's why it's more of a strategy adapted by professionals who have got the backup, and they've got people doing food prep for them, or they're on camps, etc., and it can all be kind of dialed in from. But for people that we're talking about, fasting or the kind of fasted rides are probably where the real bang for your buck is, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And even though I'm saying that that's 3 weeks there, you can change what you metabolize in as little as 2 hours. So like that is the extreme way to do it. There is no reason why you can't get lots of benefits by employing, like, if you could say in a week you planned 2 or maybe 3 hard days of training. If you had then on the 4 or 5 other days as easier aerobic based training, or even a rest day, that's when you could look at actually cycling different dietary days to couple, the training. So it's matching the fuel intake with the training intake. So it's making what you're doing very specific. So by having 2 days in the week planned as aerobic training with a higher fat diet on those days, you will prime your body to metabolize fat and improve the ability to utilize that as a fuel source.
What is your breakfast looking like on these days, Finn? Simple. What are you eating?
So if I'm doing a higher fat day, I quite like eggs as my breakfast. I like scrambled eggs, or an avocado is very, very good as well. Nuts are also a good source, but for me, I like to keep it really simple. I like scrambled eggs and some avocado. That works perfectly for me.
And it's also trying to make sure you're escaping the hidden sugars as well. So if you are having some kind of breakfast cereal, there's going to be sugar in the milk, irrespective if that's cow's milk, rice milk, oat milk, almond milk. There'll always be something in there. So even with your coffee as well, that's where some people slip up. Yeah. Taking the sugar out your coffee and taking the milk out your coffee first thing, maybe going double espresso or whatever, is probably the best way of going, because that actually flips the switch against you and then you don't actually get what you're trying to achieve. So it may seem very, very obvious, but sometimes it's hard to take your brain programming into what you like, into the application of what you're trying to use it for. So if in doubt, skip the milk and skip the sugar in that coffee. Have a couple of eggs and maybe an avocado or some nuts for your breakfast. Obviously, this is catering mainly for people who are omnivores or omnivore eaters. There's obviously options as well. So things potentially you could have would be a high protein vegan shake, potentially. A meal thing, which is a long plant-based dietary kind of point of view. And it can be very easily sustained across anyone who's got dietary issues, or, is unsure if they can actually do this, whether they have got a particular way in which they like to live their life when it comes from a food aspect. So it's good to actually know what you actually do, because a lot of people, they tell you about it and then they don't actually say what they do in practice. And it's really, really nice to actually see what you do. Just to wrap it up then, Finn, the key points that we've cut across are: factor in your steady state rides, disciplined within those steady state rides, make sure that you're got something, if you're doing it indoors or outdoors, something that can distract you from the potential monotony of doing that. Don't get sucked in to Strava hunt, and don't get sucked in to sit on the wheel. If you are doing it in a group or with people, make sure they're like-minded individuals and you can understand and work out something. If they want to do an effort on the hill, well, they can do that. They're just going to have to come back down the hill and meet up with you halfway up or something like that. And then obviously looking at the fact that we can help promote the ability and that plasticity that you spoke about so many times already by bringing in some form of fasted riding, but halfway through those rides, start bringing in a bit of carbohydrates so that it's not as, it could be, we don't want to get to the point where we're absolutely bonking, because that's just a recipe for disaster. And ultimately, that's the first hurdle that we come across when we try and get people into fasted riding. The first hurdle is that always like, oh, I can't do that. I need to eat my breakfast. Yes, there will be an adaptation that needs to be accounted for. So maybe don't jump into a 4-hour ride. Maybe get up, have your coffee, have your eggs, whatever you're having, have that high protein, high fat, low carbs or zero carbs. Go out, take a gel with you, take some form of food with you, just in case, because you will know when you are actually getting that depleted weight. You'll get a bit of brain fog, start feeling a bit hollow, start eating. And over time, if you incrementally increase the duration of your ride, you'll notice that you'll incrementally increase the duration that you are able to be efficient within that zone, and make sure you are pushing forward that utilization and becoming more economical as a bike rider or triathlete, runner, whatever you're doing.
Absolutely. And the only thing I would add to that as well, with the, looking at how you can ride longer, in sessions on a high fit based diet, is what happens after the session as well. And, how tired and fatigued you are, because sometimes people finish, these slightly longer rides where they're trying to do it without as many carbs, and they really notice the effect at the end of the session. Whereas as you get more adapted, you'll feel better and better at the end. So that's a really good other signal to look out for.
I suppose it's like any form of training, that it jumping right in at the deep end with really high intensity intervals, it will last for a very short period of time, but then you fall off a cliff. The same with everything when it comes to training. It has to be periodized, brought in gradually, and whether it's 1 ride a week and then you build it up to 3 rides a week, also whether it's a 2-hour ride and then you build it into a 4-hour ride, or whatever you do, the most important thing here is small steps to get that progression. But the more you do that, the quicker that progression will become. Instead of just diving straight into, eating at 6 o'clock the night before, getting up at 8, getting out the door, blowing your doors after 2 hours, then really, really struggling with yourself just to complete a 4-hour ride. It makes no sense at all. And that sometimes, unfortunately, is a mentality that a lot of people have. I've had that mentality. I've made those mistakes. So please learn from our mistakes. That's why this is called the knowledge. So please try and trust us with this part of it. But I think that pretty much wraps it up. And have you got anything kind of to add to that?
Yeah, just really, going back to the planning element of things, and really looking ahead at your week and taking 5 minutes to go, I need to eat this at this point, and make sure I know what training you're doing. So when I look at my week, I know I'm going to be eating on, the Friday night before my session on the Saturday, so that I can optimize the benefit of that session. So just take a little bit more time to plan what you're doing, and understand why you're doing each session, and that will improve your results.
I think the common theme is understanding what you're trying to achieve. And I think today you've actually really, really put some nice nutshells out there, and nice little bits of nuggets of knowledge for people to grab onto. Please do feel free to leave comments below here. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. We're putting more and more content up every week. Also pop over to whatsyourmeta.com, and we are also on all of the social medias with What's Your Meta. Finn, thank you very much for your knowledge today and your experience. Great to have somebody in the know, and not only in the know, but you're actually practicing as well. Thanks for your time, and until next Friday, folks, we'll be back with more knowledge. Take care.